Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SmartTech 247 webinar on DORA. Really delighted to have you all join us here today. DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, came into play in January 2023 and actually legally comes into play and enforceable from January 2025. And it's on the tips of the tongue of most of our customers who have anything to do with financial services business, both financial service institutions themselves and also their service providers. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to Raluca Saceanu, the CEO of SmartTech 247, and Enda Kyne, Chief Technology and Chief Operations Officer for FBD Insurance, who are going to help us with some really practical tips about DORA adoption. Raluca, Enda, you are very welcome.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks, Gavin.
So Raluca, maybe you can help us set the scene today. DORA, so what is it all about?
Yes, look, it's very nice to be here today, and thank you, Gavin, for putting this together, and of course, thank you, Enda, for joining us today. DORA is an interesting subject, and it is getting a lot more attention these days. And what we're seeing is that many financial entities have started their implementation work, but we also see other organizations that are still struggling. And it's not unusual. We saw the exact same thing happening when EU GDPR came into force. What I'd like to do now is maybe take a few moments to go through the pillars of DORA and then share some practical tips with respect to each pillar. But, if we draw the line, when it comes to DORA, the main aim of DORA is to ensure operational continuity, to minimize disruption, and to effectively manage risks. So what I'm going to do is just take a moment to quickly share one slide to keep it a little bit interactive as well. So there are 5 pillars to DORA. I'm going to go through them very, very briefly just to set the context. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Enda on how FBD Insurance have tackled the implementation journey. And I'm sure he will share many valuable tips when it comes to DORA. The first one is ICT risk management. And this is where it explains very clearly that management and senior management of a financial entity now need to take accountability for DORA, and board members, executives, and senior management, they must define the risk management strategies. They must participate in the execution of these strategies. And very importantly, they have to stay updated on the ICT risk landscape. So to a certain degree, the board now and senior management, they have to understand cyber, and they have to speak the language of cyber, which I think is important to note. They can be held accountable for non-compliance, and this is something that's relatively new in Europe and very much follows what the SEC in the US sets out as well. The second pillar is in relation to incident management, classification and reporting. So organizations now have to establish very clear procedures for detecting, managing, and reporting incidents. There are new rules and guidelines that have been published in relation to what is a material incident and what is a material data breach. And there are more coming in between June and September. And in relation to this, these technical guidelines are proposing a 2-step approach when it comes to ICT-related incidents. So first, you need to assess the impact on critical services, and the second is to applying additional criteria and ensuring that you understand the materiality of the incidents as well. From a resilience testing perspective, this is the third pillar of DORA. We can see comprehensive rules and requirements in relation to recovery plans and understanding how to restore operations after a cyber incident. And this includes data restoration, it includes system backups, it includes continuity planning as well. And the goal is to minimize downtime and to mitigate the impact that a potential incident has on business operations. The fourth one is a very interesting one, and it's probably one of the most difficult ones to manage in relation to third-party providers. And DORA now requires that every financial institution where DORA is applicable, of course, has robust risk monitoring in terms of their suppliers. They have to understand who their critical suppliers are. They have to have very strict controls in place in relation to having oversight in relation to these suppliers. Contracts need to be updated. They need to be detailed. They need to have very strict SLAs as well in place. And the critical ICT third-party service providers will have to be subject to direct oversight from the relevant authorities as well. And lastly, this is probably the lightest one. I personally feel that it's an important one as well because it promotes the collaboration and the communication between different entities when it comes to incidents, when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think the first one and the last one are closely related and should be closely related. So what we're seeing now is a lot of financial organizations putting together more practices in relation to threat intelligence and sharing relevant information with each other. So before I let Enda give his perspectives as well, I just want to take maybe 2 minutes to share a few tips from our own company when it comes to preparation for DORA in respect to each pillar. When it comes to risk management, it's really important that financial institutions develop and implement a framework for risk management as early as possible. This goes without saying, but roles and responsibilities are crucial in this case, because what tends to happen when it comes to risk management is individuals and you know, even to a certain degree, senior management move the roles and responsibilities from one another. And this has to be well established. It has to be documented. Also, when it comes to risk management, it's not just a paper exercise. I think this is important for organizations to understand, and they need to see what their exposure is. They need to assess their exposure. They need to understand what technical measures they should implement, have strong access controls in place, invest in good security tools, understand what they can do from a security operations perspective. And, you know, if they haven't done so, make sure that they implement network segmentation as well. From an incident reporting and incident management perspective, if organizations have an internal SOC or an external SOC, it's really important that the Security Operations Center is aligned with the new reporting requirements. If they are, if they have an external SOC, then the provider also needs to understand that the incident reporting is changing, and they need to comply to make sure that they give you the right information. They need to understand the data exposure as well. You know, when it comes to incidents, if you're defining how material an incident is, then you can't do that unless you understand your data really well. And thirdly, have a clear incident response team, a good communication plan in place, test the incident response plan regularly. And when you're testing the plan, make sure that you create scenarios that are relevant and difficult. It's not just a tick the box exercise. From a resilience testing perspective, I'll go through this really quickly, but Obviously, we all know that backup is important. Backup testing is important as well. And one area where we see a lot of organizations making a mistake is they outsource their backup and they don't have a good oversight when it comes to the contract and the SLAs. It's really important that if you outsource your backup and your backup testing, that you get the right reporting back from your partner. And understand who is responsible for managing the different areas of your backup as well. From a third-party provider perspective, first and foremost, you have to understand who your third-party dependencies or third-party partners are, and make sure that they have criticality assigned to them. They need to be classified, and you need to conduct thorough audits and due diligence on third parties. Not all third parties are equal. Some of them will be critical, some of them will be non-critical. So you will need to adopt different strategies when it comes to third-party risk management. And then lastly, invest in good security intelligence tools and understand how they can be customized to your business as well. And if you do have the ability to share information with your peers and other financial institutions, I think this is a really important part of the plan as well.
Super. Thank you, Raluca. Raluca, just, I mean, of the 5 pillars, in your experience from the C-level execs you deal with, what are they finding most challenging in terms of, which one are they finding most challenging in terms of implementation of technical controls?
Honestly, I think it's a combination from of the first one and the fourth one, and this is from 2 perspectives. Firstly, we see a lot of organizations struggling to understand how to take ownership of DORA. We've seen months-long arguments between IT departments and compliance teams about who's responsible. And secondly, we also see organizations struggling with effective risk management and also struggling with understanding more about their third-party providers and how to assess them.
Thank you. So one and 4. Maybe we'll come back to that later on, but thank you for that. So Enda, FBD, you're one of the leading insurance companies in Ireland. You're well used to that trio of regulation, compliance, and risk. I know that you've been spearheading and the investment that FBD have made is which is significant in DORA. Can you maybe share with us, your journey so far, please?
Thanks, Gavin. So we're classed as a high-impact financial entity in Ireland because we're the only ROI or Republic of Ireland owned insurance firm. So we're treated as one of the top tier. And obviously we comply with all the Central Bank of Ireland guidelines published to date. It's a very important part of who we are as a company. We've invested heavily in IT governance, and we've embedded a new IT risk culture. And over the last 3 years, we've developed and implemented a completely new IT risk management framework. So that resonates strongly with one of Raluca's point. And we've a semi-maturity in that area now, which is actually quite important. Last year, during the Operational Resilience Framework development and implementation, we saw DORA on the horizon. So we actually decided to invest and complete a DORA gap analysis as part of the whole OpRes gap analysis. So we're trying to actually get into this framework and get into the lens quite early. We'd already partnered with KPMG for the implementation of our IT risk management framework, and that teed us up nicely to get OpRes and DORA going last year. And in fairness, we were able to identify quite quickly the overlaps that existed between operational resilience and DORA, and as far back as Q2, Q3 last year. And at that stage, actually, we felt we were in good shape to get both of those done. We completed OpRes framework in December just last year, which was on time, and we immediately started a formal DORA program in January this year. It's resourced in IT, it's owned by IT, it's owned by our governance staff, and we work with second and third line external auditors and the CBI as well as stakeholders. So, but it's very firmly anchored in our team. And of course, we all know that a second regulatory technical standard was released in December, and we decided to take some time actually to work through that in detail. And we worked with it obviously with our consulting colleagues. obviously the key thing at that point in January to February was it led to a much larger gap analysis. And actually the amount of work suddenly became much greater than we'd estimated from that, Q3 viewpoint in 2023. And also it was evident for us that while Opera's is very customer focused, so outwardly focused, DORA is quite technical, and actually shone that lens back in. And that was important at a leadership and board basis, because it's awful easy to try and, their education about that resilience was what we're doing around the customer, our important business services. And now we're coming back to them and flipping it back inward. But obviously the first two tasks we had were to align all our IT terminology and definitions with what was now released in DORA. And we actually did a new formal detailed gap analysis. So we just started it again, even though we completed a bit of work in 23, we decided to do it properly. And obviously we're working through the total of 611 articles and sub-articles to complete the review. So there was quite a lot of numbers going on. The gap analysis made us look at all our IT policy side of things, our procedures, process documents, and see how they were aligned with DORA. And we had to look at any uplift required, even for minor terminology changes. And obviously we were areas where we're completely missing a policy, or we had to completely re-engineer a policy. And we're at the end of that stage, and we're about to kick off the implementation stage. And also, I mean, it's accentuating one of the points Raluca made. Like, policy is your guide map. It's actually the anchor for everything. We've seen across other organizations where individuals treat policy as, or should we write down what we think it is, and we don't necessarily have to follow it. It is actually crucial, and we're very lucky in that we have an IT risk management framework built in. We have a lot of staff training, leadership and board training done around that. So our basics, our bedrock and foundation is very strong, and we take policy very seriously, and we have a very, very astute governance, very, very tight governance process for all these things. So in fairness, we have the basics right, and we're able to actually move off that and get a program going.
And thank you for that. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I mean, you guys are pretty mature with, in terms of your process, your policy, and your risk management. And even then, I think you're talking about the huge amount of work that DORA is actually putting on your organization.
Absolutely, yeah. So we know that at least 400 of the articles are directly relevant. And even though we've got a huge foundation there, we have over 300 of the articles need further work. So it's substantial, even for us as quite a mature player in this, very heavily audited, internal, external, central bank. We still know we have a lot of work to get through that.
Thank you. So Raluca, I'll come back to you for a minute. So as you're working with companies who are, like FBD, who are looking at comply with DORA and get in line in time for the January deadlines, or soon after as possible, what are you seeing as the most common challenges that you're coming across in adoption of DORA?
We see the large organizations having a good readiness level in terms of the majority of the pillars that we discussed. And, we see a lot of them having a good risk management framework in place, policies and procedures, sometimes maybe struggling to effectively implement the right technical controls and the right technologies as well. And mainly because there is no definitive guidance when it comes to these security technologies, let's call them. But like I said in the beginning, we're also seeing a few organizations that haven't been in a position to do much yet. And there is a little bit of a panic going on. Now, these are not our clients. This is just something that we hear when we speak with the community in relation to DORA. We've also seen a lot of organizations that have brought in consultancy companies running gap analysis and leaving them hanging when it comes to clear implementation support. But if I were to summarize some of the challenges that we see, let's say from an operational and a technical perspective, operationally, what we see in the community is that there still lacks a bit of executive buy-in and ownership, and organizations don't really understand what their reporting obligations are. Also, when it comes to risk management and having effective ways to accurately assess risk, but they also have resource constraints in place, which I think is important to remember, because it is a very resource-intensive program, and you almost need new dedicated people and departments just managing it effectively. From a technical perspective, some of the challenges we see relate to the fact that there is a lot of technical complexity around the required solutions that organizations need to bring in, mainly to monitor incidents and report them. We feel that the guidance so far is a bit generic. It's not generic when it comes to the classification of incidents, but it's relatively generic when it comes to monitoring and the kind of tools that organizations need to invest in, whether they are SIM or EDR or IAM. We're also seeing, and I mentioned this earlier, a challenge when it comes to third-party security management, and financial organizations have a large dependency on third parties, and they're often part of a very complex ecosystem. And this introduces a lot of risks as well. We recently spoke about this at Zero Day Con, and we mentioned that almost 40% of breaches last year, for example, were connected to third parties. So you can imagine how it complicates the issue for organizations. And then thirdly, from a technical perspective, organizations simply don't understand their own exposure. Their general data security and security exposure, and in order to implement effective incident management, you need to understand how vulnerable you are and how vulnerable your data is. So that exposure piece is crucial, and it seems to be a challenge. When it comes to our clients, they are very prepared, ready for DORA. They've implemented very effective measures. We've been working with a few of them on policies and procedures, as well as security technologies and effective monitoring and management. And the clients that we have are incredibly mature when it comes to their DORA implementation so far.
Thank you, Raluca. And just maybe following up on some of the points Raluca made there, and also, you mentioned that DORA was very, very detailed and very specific. And you talked about the 400 points that FBD had to really, really focus on. What would you see as some of the critical success factors for folks who've joined us on the call here today that they should think about in terms of, taking on a successful DORA alignment?
So certainly one that's very obvious is in the first aspect for me relates to board and executive education and buy-in. We've a very active, engaged leadership team on board, and we've invested a lot of time with them in this area, and they're very aware that their engagement is vital for the success of the program. And I actually wrote down a sentence Raluca said earlier is, in fairness, our crews speak the language of cyber. So again, our risk management framework development, our cyber posture, IT security posture is all very strong, and that's been aligned with the board because we've got good funding from that. Secondly, I think we've already sort of hit on an area. Clear ownership of the overall program is a must, and that's not untypical of any program of work, and obviously includes what we want as specific DORA pillar owners. And I think the challenge here on the pillars is there's a lot of overlaps between teams, stakeholders internally, externally, and all these things need to be discussed up front. And we basically have really nominated one team member needs to own a pillar. And really important, and we work in this thing about committing to that pillar. It's not like managing it and getting it there, say, like literally they commit. And many aspects in that pillar, many articles may not specifically relate to their job, but they're responsible for it. And obviously, without clear ownership like that, it's fairly obvious that programs can drift. Raluca said it as well, key factors exist, assistance of subject matter experts. In our case, overall, we've brought in KPMG, and we do a lot of work with yourself in SmartTech 247 on IT security and cyber related. articles and how we approach them and what we do with them. I think the fact you're ISO 27001 certified and you've been heavily involved with us as a client in our audits starts us off really well. And no more than the SOC experience, you're also collecting a lot of feedback from other CISOs and CIOs, CTOs about DORA, and that we found that very helpful. And basically, you still need a core partner to advise, evaluate, and assist with all the changes, because it helps to have somebody just anchor back what is a plausible change and an outcome that makes sense. And if you can work with somebody who's got international experience, even better, because it brings more weight. And it's really good to work with third parties like yourselves who bring intellectual property or IP to the game. And you're not sort of trying to give us a blank page to develop that from scratch. And last but not least, in any program, and especially DORA, keeping up momentum. We've seen a few occasions where, because of the sheer number of articles to be addressed, too easy for individual teams to get bogged down, technical detail, some of it is quite complex. But we actually have sort of like a white flag analogy is if teams feel they're actually getting sucked into that rabbit hole or rat hole, they call for help fairly fast. And we all coalesce around what is the right outcome. Because sometimes one article overlaps in another, and we want to make sure that people get the right outcome. And we keep the program moving. So we're very driven by our critical path. And we're quite strong on achieving that as well. Because, as I've said earlier, we have a really good foundation in all the key things we need about how we're set up for this. So it ain't easy, but we still can be quite successful at it if we keep the focus right.
So, Raluca, DORA, probably had two key objectives in mind. One was to consolidate a lot of the different regulatory frameworks and legal frameworks around, what's happening from a digital resilience perspective. The other one was to really strengthen to really improve the strength of the IT security and protection right across the financial services industry. So the risk environment we live in is highly dynamic, right? DORA will come and it will happen. Are you seeing best practices in DORA really improve the resilience and risk posture of the financial services community?
Yes, like I said earlier, we are seeing a lot of financial organizations making significant progress when it comes to their DORA readiness. More and more are implementing very good risk management frameworks. And when it comes to reducing risk, we're seeing a lot of organizations understanding that they need to measure their posture better, like Enda said as well. Posture management is probably the key word for 2024, and it's a good starting point for a lot of organizations. So we're working with them to get them to understand their exposure, get them to understand their posture as well, and they are following best practice implementations that other organizations are adopting when it comes to other regulations. So in many ways, DORA is borrowing technical requirements from NIST and from EU GDPR as well. And I think we have so many regulations now when it comes to cybersecurity that it's pretty straightforward when it comes to what to implement and what you need to do. So from a risk reducing perspective, many companies are looking at their access controls, for example, at their networks with a different lens. They're looking at their data, and I think this has changed quite a lot in the last year. And primarily, of course, because we create more data than we ever have, and it is being vulnerable. And, when it comes to ransomware attacks, a lot of data is being exfiltrated as well, rather than encrypted. So encryption is still an important topic, but data management and data security from the other side, like understanding it from a risk perspective and protecting it, is also quite important as well. We're seeing organizations implement more threat intelligence, and more measures to train their users, for example. This has gotten more attention lately, mainly because of the growth in phishing and social engineering. And again, you know, you can borrow a lot of best practices from other regulations and other frameworks as well. And there is progress being made. However, one area that perhaps these financial entities are lacking is a bit more technical expertise and seeking help from the guys and the girls that are on the front lines of data security and cybersecurity.
Thank you, Raluca. And in describing the journey so far, you talked a bit about the organization structure, assigning responsibility, ownership, you know, driving the journey. But I know also that, you know, how you had to really drive change in the culture of the organization. FBD has been also crucial to how you've addressed DORA. Can you maybe, you know, and I know you're on your DORA journey, can you maybe at this stage talk about kind of lessons learned, but also kind of layer in that, you know, from a culture perspective, what did it mean?
I suppose, obviously, start as early as you can. We have articulated it as a journey. It's not an event. Oftentimes with regulation, we tend to have an end date for regulation, new laws coming in, and happen to have things ready and a sort of a one and done. This is much more a longer term, a longer tail process. And basically it really changes how we view and execute a lot of our IT processes, and affects our businesses, affects our stakeholders. And obviously, you know, we're strong advocates for governance, risk, compliance, audit. I mean, it's part of our day job. It's not an add-on or an afterthought. And one of the things I've said in the past is, like, we wanted at IT to have a seat around the top table and board table for a long, long time, right? DORA helps make this happen. So, I mean, definitely for like-minded senior manager, C-level, get out there, get some of your directorship qualifications, can really see that narrative coming, that more and more boards and more C-level teams want very, very strong IT, CISO type skill sets at those levels. So, but that comes with responsibility, you know, so suck it up and get on with it. Obviously, secondly, I think we've talked about the importance of bringing advisory companies and partners to the table who know what they're doing. And that's really important. Don't try to do this on your own. It's not going to end well. And lastly, you know, we've talked about full backing from the board, executive and senior management. We now have DORA in all our discussions about strategy, project prioritizations, investment decisions, and how our BAU activities change. And big thing for us at the moment is, in looking at our budget planning for 2025 and onwards, we will actually significantly add headcount into our run teams, because we know, and to Raluca's point as well, many things have to come back in-house if we want to be able to keep on top of those. But also, we have an awful lot more evidence to continually gather to demonstrate we're meeting and beating the requirements of DORA. So there's a cost there. And it's not just about educating leadership on board, it's actually getting their heads into the fact this is a new OPEX run rate. And we have to take it important. And in ways, the legislative aspects of it, you're pushing an open door, because, you know, executive teams know we've got to do something about this. But again, it's important to have a leadership team and a board who are fully behind this, because the changes are not trivial.
Thank you, Enda. And just to add to the audience here today, I see the questions are starting to come in, so really appreciate that, folks. Please get your questions into the Q&A, and we have the results of our poll. So you know, it looks like across the board, you know, well, 63% of people say third-party risk management is the most challenging one to implement. So right in line with your pillar 4, Raluca, you know, super stuff. So when I talk to the consultants here in Smart Tech about the work we're doing in DORA, and I'm saying, you know, so what's the biggest surprise when you go out and talk to customers about this, and we work with them on that journey? They all say, like, it's the expectation and the detail and the lack of flexibility that you have in implementing DORA. Maybe, Enda, you know, can you maybe just reflect on that for a second? Like, you know, is this an easy one? Is it flexible? Can you get around it? How do you see it?
where it comes to changing policies, I think that's sort of fairly straightforward once you don't overbake it. That's not a huge thing. And sometimes about investment. Also, I mean, for us, in some cases, it's getting away from Excel to track particular outcomes, and actually it's tooling up. That's really important, right? So we're investing in products and solutions to do that. And also it's much easier to audit how a tool is used than to have to reference how every cell in Excel spreadsheet is reviewed and updated. That's one thing. I think the incident management one is tricky because it's still quite vague about, well, you know, how quickly do you really need to respond to it? What type of information are you giving in the incident management process and update? And a lot of times you'd be really actually, it could take you half a day to even triage what's going on with sets of third parties, your IT supply chain before you get into it. So that's a tricky one. And I suppose the last one is when we look at information security, even though, I mean, with yourselves, we do a lot of pen testing, there's sort of an about face for how we need to articulate our plan to adapt to cyber threats and how we position ourselves. So it's subtle and getting in there. So I think there are wins that are there, some tricky. The one I'm worried about actually is when you have an existing supplier base and you have a strong contractual relationship, every time you mention a modification to a contract, it's nearly like a full commercial review. So as a buyer of services, I'm worried about a very, very long, drawn-out process where we're getting suppliers starting to try to renegotiate long-term contracts. That's actually my most worrisome part.
Okay, super. Thank you. So we questioned in the chat from Karen Doyle. Maybe this one for you, Raluca. Do you think the scope of DORA will be expanded outside of financial services and their third parties?
It's an interesting question because in many ways, if you think about what's coming down with NIS2 and the other regulations and requirements that are in force at the moment, they, like I said earlier, they do encompass a lot of it already. So NIS2, you know, from a critical infrastructure perspective, has many industries that fall into that already. I think that we are perhaps lacking a completely uniform regulation, and this will probably come down the line at some stage in the next few years, where it will be, you know, a combination of EU GDPR, DORA, NIS2, all in one, with a really good comprehensive framework for how every single organization should implement cybersecurity and measures. I don't think there's any organization in the industry that doesn't have to do one of them, because obviously the biggest one is GDPR. So the changes that we expect to see are most likely in the GDPR area, where they will learn from the resilience testing aspect of DORA. I don't know, Enda, what do you think?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, Raluca. I do agree with you. And GDPR is quite principles-based. So we've got a crossover between principles aspect and quite strong technical legislation. Interestingly, one of the discussions I remember having 6-7 years ago at board was where we wanted to position our investment in terms of cyber and IT security. And we were saying we'd like to be middle of the pack or slightly above, but we weren't in a position to be best in class. But over time, our audits, internal, external, and regulator, have asked for gold standard. So it became the norm that whatever was in vogue, and I can see from the large audit firms, even if you're not in scope for DORA, you can see that they will be asking those questions of boards at audit time that says, how do you demonstrate you align with industry standards or best practice, which is a great one, which means everybody gets dragged to the same level eventually over time. So I do think it's inevitable that most large companies, or certainly anybody over 250 headcount, will eventually have to meet and beat those standards. And it's you know, it's an audit world. We have to, everything you hear on the television is about companies not aspiring or meeting governance standards or meeting audit outcomes, quite vague things to person in the street. But I think we know heart and soul that we'll all be working to DORA or a future version of DORA, regardless of industry sector over time.
Thanks, Enda. So before I just ask Enda, yourself and Raluca just to give a kind of short closing comment, I just want to thank everyone for joining us here today. Really appreciate it. A couple of things. If you're interested in this too, as Raluca has just been talking about, we are running a webinar next Wednesday, 3 p.m. So join SmartTech and Splunk to chat about this too, and this too adoption. And also, please watch out for, we've a couple of the artifacts that were shared today. We'll share them out to the group so people have that, and you've also access to the brochure that we will publish around DORA as well. So maybe Enda, maybe I can just, any last comments from you?
Thanks, Gavin. Engineering folks don't like rules being pushed on them. It's human nature that we like to solve problems, but actually have freedom. And in the world we live in, it's sort of a fact of life. I think in most individual cases, the majority of the rules and regulations actually increase and improve the standards and quality about what we do as technologists. In reality, if we were sitting on boards or audit committees and risk committees, we'd be asking these questions. How do we know as an organization we can do this? So I think DORA is actually answering those questions. I think the stress comes when you layer in third parties examining at speed what you're doing, for instance, or they're interpreting their legislation in their view, and you've implemented something else. That brings the stress. I think that's where it's challenging going forward. And obviously it's Europe-wide, hasn't been done before. So there'll be a lot of moving parts. So I think there's really strong positive things. Embrace it. It's the future. And use it. Every crisis is an opportunity. Use it. Get your resources, get your budgets, get around that top table, get on board tables. It's time for tech staff to actually get our share of control. We need to actually get in there and make the right things happen.
All right. Thank you, Enda. Thank you very much. Raluca.
Yeah, well, look, firstly, if you're not getting the executive buy-in that you need, I think I learned this from Enda a while back. Why don't you create a fake news article, put your company name on it, and put it on the front of the pages and see how they react, which I always thought was a really cool way to get your message across. But I'm going to keep it simple, the takeaways, keep it, don't make it just a paper exercise. Understand what your exposure is, understand your posture, and stress test your plans, whether they are incident response plans or business continuity. I can see here from the chat, and it's not surprising that one of the most difficult or one of the challenging elements of this is third parties. And you have to start somewhere. And what we see most organizations do is they get external help for this. So if you're struggling, you need to seek external validation and support because you're not alone on this journey. And it's always good to get a second pair of eyes and get that validation that you need, that you're on the right track.
Super. Thank you, Raluca. So listen, folks, we're out of time. Really appreciate you joining us here today, and thank you for your contribution, Raluca. Thank you very much also for your contribution. At SmartTech, it's all about collaboration, right? It's all about learning from each other. Zero-day economy has been the heart of us driving the conversation for many years now, and we're looking to continue that. So please join us in future on these webinars, and really appreciate the input from everybody today. Thank you, Enda and Raluca.